Wait, Mary, it's me, said a familiar voice on the phone. I froze, my heart skipped a beat. It was Stephen. I couldn't believe it. 10 years ago, he ran away with Sarah, the wife of our son Michael. After that, they seemed to disappear into thin air. They went missing, and I did my best to erase them from my life and memory. There were no letters, no calls, not a single mention. But now, after all these years, that voice came on the phone, the voice of the man I once loved and then hated. Don't you want to know why I'm calling? He said, as if expecting me to hang up. His voice was cold and brusque. Stephen, I said stiffly. Mary, do you still live with your parents? What is it? He asked sharply. Because I need you to move out. I'm going to live in their house. I was numb. What kind of arrogance is that? He did not apologize for his actions, did not explain where he had been all this time, just demanded my parents' house. He spoke as if nothing had happened between us in these 10 years. Have you remarried? He continued, laughing mockingly. You'll probably have to move anyway. This is my home now. Anger rose in me in a wave, but I didn't let it get the better of me. This man didn't know who I had become. He still saw in front of him the 50-year-old woman he had abandoned. But I was no longer who he remembered me to be. If you're talking about my parents' house, then it's not here anymore, I said calmly. There was silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean? What is it? He asked, his voice trembling for the first time. It was a moment that turned everything around. I realized that I was no longer afraid of him. That fear, that despair that haunted me in the past, has disappeared. I've become different. Determined. Self-confident. This house was sold a few years ago, I added. I don't need to live with my parents anymore. I've been living my life for a long time. His confusion was almost palpable. I enjoyed this short pause, as if it were a small victory over the man who once caused me so much pain. Mary, he began, but didn't finish. Now it was my turn to control the situation. My name is Mary Kane. I am 60 years old. I work as a teacher in a private school because I love my profession. Once upon a time, my parents, both respected teachers, inspired me to take this path, and I am proud to have followed in their footsteps. Stephen was a part of my past life, but he will never be a part of my future. Stephen and I met in college when I was 21 years old. I worked as a tutor to pay for my studies and was moving step by step towards my dream of becoming a teacher. Stephen joined our small teaching team as a new tutor. He was a little older than me, but in this strange combination of maturity and insecurity, I saw something attractive. I was asked to help him settle into a new place, because I already had experience working with students. We started planning lessons together, discussing study materials, and then staying late after work just to talk. These were warm, relaxed evenings filled with laughter and the delicate contact of worlds. A year later, we couldn't imagine life without each other. 3 years later, we got married. The wedding was modest, but full of happiness and hope. And soon our son Michael was born, and we were completely immersed in the joy of parenthood. Life seemed perfect. I found a permanent job at school. Stephen also got a good job. We built a life together full of tradition and love. When Michael grew up, he went to design school in New York City. His talent was quickly noticed, and he began working as a designer of prototype figurines. It seemed like an unusual but surprisingly creative job. We were proud of him. When he married Sarah, a young woman full of energy and charm, our joy was boundless. We imagined how one day they would give us grandchildren, and dreamed of family meetings. But everything changed one evening when Michael unexpectedly returned home. I saw his tired face and immediately realized that he was worried about something. "Mom," he began, choosing his words slowly, "are you and Dad still together?" "Of course," I replied, frowning. What happened? He looked away, as if struggling with himself, and finally said, I saw Dad with Sarah the other day, in Brooklyn. There was an oppressive silence in the room. Michael continued by telling how he had accidentally noticed the two of them last Friday night. They walked arm in arm along a busy street, clearly not hiding their relationship. My son, torn between curiosity and anxiety, followed them and watched them enter one of the hotels. I tried to imagine that it was a misunderstanding, an accident, but Michael took out his phone and showed me a photo. Stephen and Sarah were pictured there, smiling, hand in hand. My thoughts were racing like hunted animals. On that very Friday, Stephen came home late, explaining that he was overworking. Now his words sounded like a lie. Looking back, I realized how many of these late returns, explanations about extracurricular activities, happy hours with colleagues, or sudden business trips. It all seemed like part of the complicated lie I'd been living for the last few months. I assured Michael that I would deal with it. After he left, I was left alone in the silence of our cozy house, which now seemed empty and cold. When Stephen returned that evening, I already knew what I had to say. When Stephen finally entered the house, his gait was uneven and the air around him smelled of alcohol. This smell was disgusting to me, as if I could feel the bitterness of the whole situation physically. But I didn't let my irritation get the better of me. This was my moment, and I was going to get answers. Stephen, I began, firmly and calmly. I saw Michael today. He told me something. Tell me, is it true that you met with Sarah last Friday? Stephen froze, his face turned stony for a moment. Then he stammered. Yes, we met briefly. I thought I told you that, didn't I? He tried to sound confident, but his nervousness was obvious. His eyes darted around the room as if he was looking for a way to escape from this conversation. That eye movement, his sudden dryness in his throat, all screamed that he was lying. Michael said he saw you too. I deliberately paused, then took out my phone. Here, I showed him the photo. He saw you and Sarah enter the hotel in Brooklyn. Together. Stephen's face turned pale, as if the blood had drained from his cheeks. His eyes widened and his hands trembled slightly. He sank into a chair, avoiding my gaze. I didn't think Michael would notice, he muttered. Stephen, my voice faltered, but I quickly pulled myself together. You're not even trying to deny it? There's no point, he managed to say. It's all out anyway. And then his monologue began. Stephen admitted that his relationship with Sarah began 6 months ago. He claimed that it was Sarah who made the first move, that she was too persistent, and he gave in. These words sounded like thunderclaps in my head, but the worst part was that at that moment he didn't even try to justify himself. He continued with a strange mixture of complacency and despair. Mary, I love her. I realized it back then. I want to be with Sarah, and I need a divorce. His words hit me like lightning. I could barely comprehend what was happening. For a moment, it seemed to me that this was some kind of nightmare from which I was about to wake up. You want what? I exclaimed, barely holding back the anger that was bursting out. Divorce, he repeated, coldly and indifferently. I can't stay with you anymore. I want to marry Sarah. I tried to argue. I tried to convey to him that this was not just a mistake, that he was destroying everything we had built together. But Stephen was adamant. His words cut me like knives. This is out of the question, he concluded, rising from his chair. I'm leaving. Stephen did not return home the next day. His things had disappeared from the closet, and there was a completed divorce application on the table. It was the last point in our life together. Later, I got a call from Michael. His voice was shaking with tears. Mom. Sarah left me too, he said in a strangled voice. She took her things and left me the divorce papers. She just left. Sarah and Stephen disappeared together, leaving nothing behind but resentment and devastation. That's how my marriage ended, which lasted more than 20 years. After the divorce, Stephen and I sold our house together. It was painful, but necessary. I moved closer to work, to a small but cozy house, where I began to rebuild my life. Those events left a deep mark on my soul, but at the same time made me realize how strong I am. In the silence of the new walls, I began to piece myself together, finding inner peace and peace where there had been chaos before. At first, I was overcome with deep sadness. Loneliness, like a thick fog, enveloped my life, casting a shadow over every corner of my soul. But over time, with the pain, I learned to find solace. My work, which has always been a source of joy for me, has become the very pillar that helped me begin healing. Teaching brought not only satisfaction, but also a sense of belonging, allowing me to regain my purpose. I got closer to my students, their sincere questions and thirst for knowledge brought me back to life. My colleagues, seeing my loneliness, surrounded me with care, like a soft protective shell. Even after reaching retirement age, I continued to work, at least part-time. It kept my spirits up and prevented me from indulging in bitter thoughts about the past. Over the years, Stephen and Sarah have become only a distant memory, a faint echo in the corners of my memory. Day after day, I thought about them less and less. Michael also found a way to deal with the pain. He completely immersed himself in his work, his passion for design was revived, and he began to achieve success. His achievements have become a source of pride and relief for me. We both learned to move on, building our lives anew. But one day a phone call changed everything. "Hi," I replied, hearing a familiar beep. There was a voice on the other end that sent a chill down my spine. "Mary, this is Stephen," he said. Those words, those intonations that I hadn't heard in 10 years, hit me harder than I could have imagined. I felt my fingers tighten around the tube, and a storm of emotions began to rise inside. "What do you want?" I asked sharply, not trying to hide my irritation. Stephen, on the other hand, seemed calm, almost casual, as if this call was just a matter of routine. Hey, he said with a light laugh. "Why are you so upset? We decided that a long time ago. You agreed to the divorce yourself, right?" His words blew me up. I couldn't help myself. "You've ruined everything, Stephen," I shouted, forgetting about my efforts to be cool. "You destroyed everything we built. You're not my husband. I don't even want to hear from you." But he ignored my anger and, as if nothing had happened, got to the point. "Listen," he began, "do you still live at your parents' house?" I was wary. "Why do you ask?" "Sarah and I need a place." "She's pregnant," he said, as if the news should have made me happy. "We are planning to move in with you." I was stunned by his audacity. My breathing quickened, my heart was pounding, and my anger was boiling. "Are you crazy?" I finally shouted, barely able to find the words. "How dare you?" But Stephen, as always, remained impassive. "Understand," he began to explain. "A child is expensive. We didn't know it would be so hard. We both quit our jobs to focus on a fresh start, but it turned out to be harder than we thought. We need to live somewhere." His voice was half confident, half pleading. I heard how he tried to justify his decision, how he tried to muffle his own guilt, if it existed at all. He went on to describe how their relationship was passionate despite the 30-year age difference. But since Sarah got pregnant, their lives have changed. They both quit their jobs to focus on preparing for the birth of a child. Now, with no income, they were looking for a way to survive, and in his opinion, I had to be their solution. But every phrase, every word, sounded like a slap in the face to me. Stephen continued his story as if it were some kind of dark confession, although his voice still sounded cold and indifferent. He admitted that their money had run out long ago, and he and Sarah were barely making ends meet, getting by on odd jobs. The child took all their strength and finances. Sarah could no longer work after giving birth, and bills and expenses snowballed. I even tried to ask Michael for help, he said, almost resentfully. But he refused to see me. Can you imagine? His own son. I even thought about asking my parents for money, but they also turned their backs on me. They're all so stubborn. He laughed as if it was a funny coincidence and not his own failure. That laugh jarred on my ears. I remembered his family, a strict father, a strong-willed mother, a serious younger brother. I met them a long time ago, and they seemed to me to be people of principle, proud, with a strong sense of morality. Even then, I knew that they would never accept such a betrayal as Stephen had committed. And now he was complaining about them, expecting one of us to make concessions for the sake of his new life. And you're saying that you want me to leave my house for you too? I asked, my voice shaking with rage. Yes, he answered bluntly, as if it were something that was taken for granted. Sarah and our child are more important. You're just a single woman, and you have nothing but a job as a teacher. Those words pierced me like a cold blade. I felt my hands tremble and my heart clench with pain and anger. It was too much, even for him. Go to hell, Stephen. I cried, barely holding back tears. How dare you even come to me with this? I never imagined Stephen could be so cruel. Over the years, I've probably softened my memories of him, remembering him not only as a traitor, but also as the person I once shared a life with. But now all illusions have been dispelled. Gathering my courage, I spoke in a cold and firm voice. If you're talking about my parents' house, then it's gone. He is not yours, and he will never be yours. These words seemed to deafen Stephen. He froze, as if he couldn't believe his ears. What? What do you mean? Where do you live now? His voice became impatient, almost desperate. I won't tell you where I live, I replied firmly. And even if I did, you'd never enter this house. Never. Don't come here. Stephen was stunned, but that didn't stop him from continuing. His voice became louder, more irritated. What about my inheritance? When your parents died, the family home and the money were supposed to go to me, right? These words caused a storm of rage in me. How could he talk so coldly about my parents' death, thinking only about money? How could he be so selfish? You don't know, Stephen, I began, pausing to hide my growing excitement. My parents were outraged by your behavior. Your betrayal 10 years ago completely deprived you of the right to anything. You got no house, no money, no inheritance. You don't deserve a dime. My heart was pounding, but my voice sounded clear and firm. It was the truth, which he apparently did not know. My parents, disappointed in him, excluded him from the will in advance. When Michael and I told my parents about what Stephen and Sarah had done, it was like a lightning bolt in their lives. My parents have always treated Stephen like their own son. They trusted him, opened the doors of their home, and supported him in all his endeavors. His betrayal was an unbearable blow to them. They were deeply wounded, but even then they tried to behave with dignity. Before his death, his parents made their wishes clear in their wills. They left everything to me, the house, the savings, everything that mattered to them. It was their last way to protect what they loved from those who might abuse their trust. After the betrayal, Stephen and Sarah were excluded from their circle of care, and their names were deleted from the family legacy. My father passed away 7 years after that terrible story. It was a difficult moment for the whole family, but especially for me. His loss left a void that could not be filled. My mother, a strong and strong-willed woman, lived for several more years, despite the deep pain of loss and disappointment. She left a year ago, and I was left alone, with a house filled with memories. This house was too big for me. Every room held echoes of laughter and voices that I would never hear again. Following my parents' wishes, I sold it, knowing that they would prefer to see it in the hands of people who value it as much as they do. When I told Stephen about this, his reaction was predictably angry. "Don't pretend like it's all yours," he shouted. "You can't just take everything away." I kept my composure, even though I was boiling inside. "Stephen," I began slowly and clearly, "I inherited this house legally. My parents would never forgive me if I gave it to you, especially after what you did." Stephen realized that his game was lost. He didn't say anything, just wandered around senselessly, as if trying to find a way out of despair. Finally, in utter despair, he hung up the phone. I stared at the phone, feeling anger mixed with pain. How could someone I've spent so many years with be so selfish, so petty? He abandoned everyone who loved him, and then returned, waiting for help, as if nothing had happened. My life has gone the other way in these 10 years, but Stephen and Sarah have remained in the past that I buried long ago. While I was still digesting his insolence, the phone rang again. It was Sarah. "I didn't even know your parents were dead," she snapped, her voice harsh and feigning resentment. "How could you be so heartless and not tell me? They were my friends." Her words sounded artificial, devoid of sincerity. If she really cared about my parents, she would have expressed her condolences or at least asked if it was possible to visit their graves. But her second sentence quickly put everything in its place. "Why didn't you tell me about the inheritance?" After all, this is what they would like to convey. I felt everything boil inside me. She was only interested in money and possessions, and not in the memory of those people whom she supposedly respected. It was too much. "Sarah," I interrupted her in mid-sentence, "you have no right to any of this. Don't ever call me again." I hung up the phone, feeling relieved, as if I had thrown away an extra burden that had weighed on me all these years. But the calm did not last long. Michael called later. "Mom, Dad, and Sarah came to see me," he said. "No, they didn't come to me, but they called," I replied. "They asked about the house and the inheritance." On the other end of the line, I heard Michael sigh heavily. "Mom," he said after a long pause, "I thought they might contact you. They came to see me the other day." "Michael, are you all right?" I asked, anxiously clutching the phone. "Did they do anything?" "It's all right, Mom," he reassured me. "They made a big scene, knocking on the door, shouting. But when I said I'd call the police, they ran away." His voice sounded calm, but I felt a hidden weariness and anger. Stephen and Sarah had crossed all boundaries, and I knew that it couldn't just be left like that. "But I have an idea," Michael added. He explained his plan, and I agreed. It's time to put an end to this chaos that Stephen and Sarah have been bringing into our lives. It was not only for my sake, but also for my son's. Michael started acting right away, and after a few days everything started spinning. Stephen called me late at night. His voice was on the verge of hysteria. "Hey, Mary. You did that, didn't you?" he shouted, trying to hide the panic tension behind rudeness. "Is this your job?" "What are you talking about, Stephen?" I asked calmly, holding back a grin. "Don't play the fool," he continued, almost shouting. "They're in my apartment now. 7 women, Mary. 7. They've made hell here." I was silent, letting him talk. He continued, describing more and more incoherently the scene unfolding in his apartment. These women turned out to be his mistresses, each of whom came with anger and resentment. The scene turned into chaos, screams, tears, even a fight. Sarah, unable to stand it, began to yell at Stephen, and he, in turn, took out his anger on her. You knew, didn't you? How could you arrange this? He shouted into the phone. Stephen, I finally said, keeping my icy calm. You ruined your own life. Don't blame me for this. You did it 10 years ago, and you're doing it now. His stream of swearing continued, but I was adamant. Goodbye, Stephen. Don't ever show your face to me or our son again, I finished, hanging up the phone. This chaos he was talking about was the culmination of Michael's plan. After Stephen and Sarah knocked on his door, Michael hired a private investigator. The investigation turned out to be fruitful. The detective found out that Stephen had relationships with 7 women, 3 of whom were married. They were all deceived and angry. We have gathered information about the whereabouts of Stephen and Sarah and anonymously notified these women. They came to him on the same evening, and the scene that Stephen described in his call became a reality. The screams attracted the attention of the neighbors, who called the police. Soon Sarah left Stephen forever. She packed her things and left for an unknown destination. However, the consequences for both of them were just beginning. 3 of the women who turned out to be married sued Stephen, demanding alimony. The amounts he had to pay exceeded 6 figures. He lost everything: Sarah, money, and housing. He was last seen in the soup kitchen, where he was standing in line for a hot meal. Sarah didn't escape the consequences either. Her financial situation became so desperate that she borrowed money from a dubious company. But soon people in strict black suits came for her, and no one has seen her since. The chapter about Stephen and Sarah was finally closed. I returned to my usual, peaceful life. Teaching, as before, brought me joy, and working with students became a source of happiness for me. Michael also found a way to a new beginning. He started dating a woman named Claire. She had a young son, whom Michael accepted as his own. They were planning a future together, and I sincerely hoped that Michael would find the happiness he deserves.